Japan's justice system has a conviction rate of 99%, one of the highest in the world. Once you're arrested, you don't fight the system. You don't wait for fair trial. You either confess or you disappear inside the system. In 2018, one of the most powerful executives in the world was arrested, and instead of breaking, he escaped Japan, hidden inside a box. On November 19, 2018, a private jet landed in Tokyo's Haneda's airport. Carlos Ghosn stepped off the plane like he did dozens of times. Chairman of Nissan, CEO of Renault, one of the most powerful executives in global business. Minutes later, Japanese prosecutors were waiting, paperwork prepared, and the decision was already made. By the end of the day, Carlos Ghosn was locked inside a detention center, cut off from his family, his company, and the outside world, and almost no one saw it coming. The charge wasn't theft or embezzlement. It was that he failed to disclose compensations that he might receive in the future. In most countries, that leads into an investigation. But in Japan, it leads to detention and months of pressure to confess. The question isn't whether Carlos is guilty or innocent. The real question is, how does a man trapped inside one of the most powerful justice systems in the world manage to leave the country before the system closes completely? Carlos Ghosn was born in Brazil to Lebanese parents, educated in France, and trained as an engineer at Europe's elite schools. His career was built around one thing: fixing companies everyone else had given up on. In the 1990s, Carlos was a rising executive in Renault. The French automaker was struggling with shrinking margins and declining competitiveness, and it needed a financial surgery to survive. Carlos Ghosn delivered. He slashed costs, closed inefficient plants, and renegotiated suppliers' contracts that had been untouched for decades. Within few years, Renault's operating margin stabilized, and the company returned to consistent profitability. And that reputation mattered in 1999, when Renault made the risky decision. Nissan, the Japanese car maker, was in deep trouble. Over $20 billion in debt, 8 consecutive years of losses, operating margins in the negative, dozens of factories running way below capacity. Instead of letting Nissan collapse, Renault bought 36.8% of the company. At the time, Nissan was structurally broken, and Japanese banks had lost patience. Analysts openly discussed bankruptcy. Internally, decision-making was paralyzed by hierarchy and traditions, and Renault needed someone who could do what Japanese leadership could not: break the system without asking permission. And they chose Carlos Ghosn. He was sent to Japan as Renault's representative, then quickly promoted inside Nissan. He arrived as a foreigner and unfamiliar with Japanese corporate etiquette. Carlos did not pretend to understand Nissan. He studied it, and then he challenged it. Within months, he announced the Nissan revival plan. It was aggressive, public, and unforgiving. 5 factories closed, over 20,000 jobs cut worldwide, long-standing suppliers' ties dismantled, cross-shareholding unwound. And these were moves that Japanese executives avoided for decades. Carlos gave himself 3 years. If Nissan didn't return to profitability, he said he would resign. And the result shocked everyone. In 2000, Nissan posted its first profit in years. And by 2002, it had one of the highest operating margins in the auto industry. Debt was slashed, cash flow stabilized, and the company was eventually saved. Carlos Ghosn became a symbol. In Japan, he was nicknamed Le Cost Killer. In France, he was treated as a proof that Renault's gamble had paid off. Globally, he became one of the most powerful executives in the auto industry. But success changed the balance. Renault owned Nissan, and Nissan became more profitable than Renault. And the man connecting them controlled both. The whole system was balanced on one person, and systems like that never stay stable for a long time. In Japan, business culture is based on balance. Executives rise slowly, decisions are shared, and no single person is meant to dominate. But Carlos Ghosn dominated everything. He was the CEO of Nissan, CEO of Renault, and chairman of the entire alliance. He spoke directly to the media, made unilateral decisions, and publicly criticized inefficiency. Inside Nissan, some executives admired him, while others quietly resented him. And one name mattered most. Hiroto Saikawa. Saikawa was a long-time Nissan insider, and he was eventually promoted to CEO. But even with the title, real power still sat above him, with Carlos. As talks of deeper integration between Nissan and Renault started, fear grew. A full merger would mean Nissan losing autonomy, Japanese leadership would be answering to Paris, and a national icon will be controlled by a foreigner. This wasn't just corporate anxiety, it was cultural. And quietly, the question inside Nissan changed. It was no longer, is Carlos Ghosn good enough? It became, how do we remove him without tearing the company apart? Behind closed doors, compliance teams were activated, emails were reviewed, pay structures were examined, all in order to find leverage. On November 19, 2018, Carlos Ghosn landed at Haneda Airport in Tokyo. He had done this trip dozens of times. Same schedule, same private jet. But this time, when the plane stopped, Japanese prosecutors were already waiting. And the moment he stepped out of the plane, he was taken aside. And within hours, the headline appeared. Carlos Ghosn had been arrested for financial misconduct. He was denied bail, held for weeks, then months. And what made the arrest unusual wasn't the charge. It was the timing and who benefited. For months, a small group of Nissan executives had been cooperating with prosecutors, providing internal emails and documents that only insiders could supply. Hiroto Saikawa was at the center of it. The same man that Carlos had promoted now watched as control shifted overnight. The alliance froze, merger discussions vanished, and Renault's influence weakened immediately. Nissan held an emergency board meeting, and in less than an hour, Carlos Ghosn was removed as chairman. For the public, it was framed as accountability, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Nissan was Japanese once again. Carlos Ghosn, meanwhile, was alone in a cell, and the Japanese system was just starting. And this is where most stories get emotional. But we won't. Japanese justice system isn't chaotic, it's precise. Prosecutors don't arrest unless they expect conviction. And detention isn't about waiting for a trial, it's about pressure. Suspects are questioned daily, access is limited, confessions simplify everything. For most defendants, resistance is pointless. But Carlos Ghosn wasn't most defendants. The message that the justice system sent was very clear. You will cooperate, or you will disappear inside the system. Carlos Ghosn chose a third option. After months in detention, Carlos was released on bail, technically free, but practically trapped. He lived under constant surveillance. Cameras monitored his house, internet access was restricted, and his wife was barred from contacting him. Japan believed that the pressure would work and that eventually he would break. But something else happened. Carlos started planning, not a legal defense, but an exit. He reached out quietly to trusted partners outside Japan, former associates, private security consultants, people experienced in moving discreetly across borders. One name would later surface: Michael Taylor, a former US Special Force soldier turned private security operator. The plan took months, and it required perfect timing. No one believed that this escape was possible. On December 29, 2019, Carlos Ghosn left his Tokyo residence. He took a train to Osaka, where the escape team was waiting for him at a hotel near the airport. Carlos changed his clothes, then jumped inside the large audio equipment case, the kind used to transport musical instruments. The case was rolled out of the hotel as ordinary luggage. At Kansai International Airport, private jet passengers were not subject to the same procedure as normal travelers. No X-ray and no passport control for cargo. The box was loaded onto a private jet, and the jet took off to Turkey. And by the time Japanese authorities realized that Carlos Ghosn was missing, the plane was already in the air. From Turkey, he was transferred to another flight, and his final destination was his home country, Lebanon. And with that, his escape was concluded. Today, Carlos Ghosn lives in Beirut, Lebanon, publicly, openly, and untouchable. Lebanon does not extradite its citizens, and Carlos holds Lebanese citizenship. He continues to give interviews from his home, while Japan still considers him as fugitive. Nissan considers him as criminal, and French courts remain cautious. Carlos Ghosn will probably not return to Japan. He will not stand trial there. The system never really got its verdict. Instead, history is left with one unresolved ending. A man who saved a company, and a system who decided he was too powerful, and an escape that no one believed was possible. It's a reminder that justice depends on borders, and that sometimes escaping the system is easier than beating it. Carlos Ghosn did not win the case, he simply escaped it. The question isn't whether Carlos Ghosn is innocent or guilty. The question is simpler and far more uncomfortable. When systems collide, who actually decides what justice looks like? Because in this story, the courtroom never had its final word. The airport did. This is the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have more ideas for me to cover in the next episodes, leave it in the comments. Until next time.